ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Now inshallah, in this week's program we'll be looking at verse number 28 and inshallah, if we have time, verse number 29 and verse number 30 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Now verse number 28 of Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتًا فَأَحْيَاكُمْ ثُمَّ يُمِيتُكُمْ ثُمَّ يُحْيِيكُمْ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. Now this particular verse is one of the last verses of Ruku number 3 and section number 3. And in the previous verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala touches on verses which indicate and point towards His existence. That there were verses before where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about that He is the Khaliq, He is the Creator, the world which we are living in, the ground, the zameen, the skies and so on, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created that. And also in the previous verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, establishes the finality of prophethood, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final prophet, and at the same time also mentions and talks about that the Holy Quran is the speech and is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the Holy Quran is the true words from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now verse number 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then goes on to mention some blessings and some ni'mah which He has showered on the humans, which He has showered on mankind. Now the first thing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions from verse number 28 is كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ, that how is it that you deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Takfurun means reject, deny. So how is it that you deny and reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now objection may arise from this particular verse, and that is that we will see this later on in the various chapters and surahs later, that there are many verses where He actually says that the disbelievers, they didn't reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They didn't deny that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed. They believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but what they would do is that they would think that the idols, worshipping the idols, were a means or was a mean in gaining closeness and nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there were some who thought that they believed in Allah, they thought that Allah existed, but they said that these idols will seek intercession on our behalf to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the question is that when you have these disbelievers and mushrikeen who actually believed in Allah, then why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beginning verse number 28 by saying كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ, that how is it that you deny and reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now the answer to this particular objection is that these disbelievers and mushrikeen, they did believe in Allah, that is true. However, they didn't believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as you know, it comes in the hadith like of Sahih al-Bukhari, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that whoever obeys me, he has obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whoever disobeys me, he has disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this particular verse, verse number 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, or is indicating that, okay, you did believe in me, like you did affirm, or you did kind of accept that I do exist, but because you didn't believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then denying Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rejecting Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is as though كَيْفَ تَكْفُرُونَ بِاللَّهِ, you are rejecting and denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then goes on to mention the first blessing, the first ni'mah which He has bestowed on the humans and on mankind. وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتًا فَأَحْيَاكُمْ, that all of you were lifeless before. You were all dead before, you were all lifeless, فَأَحْيَاكُمْ, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you life. So the first ni'mah and the blessing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pointing to mankind is that you were nothing before. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that we do not believe in the continuous rebirth of a soul, which is known as reincarnation. We don't believe in that. But we as Muslims, we believe in that before this world was created, all the souls Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. So we were just this kind of like floating particle, or this kind of floating kind of substance in the heaven. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He chose that soul and He said that, okay, this soul, I will give it life and he will be made to come to this world. So when you look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wanted, He couldn't, or He wouldn't have, or He could have not given us life. That's why scholars have described, like, there's two things, this is more got to do with Aqidah and faith, that we describe Allah as someone being wajibul wujud, meaning that Allah is someone, is a being who was there before the existence of this world, before the creation of this world, and Allah is someone who's going to be there at the end. Whereas our creation, the scholars describe it as mumkinul wujud, which means that if Allah wanted, He could have created us. But if Allah didn't want to, then no one can force Allah to create us. So when we look at it, we coming to this earth and we coming to this world is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we were this lifeless kind of particle and soul, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَأَحْيَاكُمْ, He gave us life. Then the next blessing and the ni'mah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, ثُمَّ يُمِيتُكُمْ, then He gave you death. Now from this we can understand that for a believer, death is a ni'mah and is a blessing. And that's why it's mentioned in another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has said that the gift of a believer, تُحْفَةُ الْمُؤْمِنِ al-maut, is death. Now obviously, you may be thinking that how can death be actually a blessing? How can death be a kind of gift? But when we look around ourselves, when we look in the society we are living in, you could actually understand that, yeah, it's true. Death is in fact a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just look around, the community, the society we're living in. People are doing all these bad things. People are committing adultery, drinking alcohol and so on. Then you get even like Muslim brothers, when talking about here, who actually, even though they may be practicing, even though they may be coming to the namaz and mosque and have a beard and so on, but then they, slander about you, then they deceive you, then they steal from you, then they backbite about you and so on. So when you are living in such a society where people are doing all these kind of things, even Muslim brothers, even your own siblings, you can't trust whether they are deceiving you or not. Then when you look at it, the only way to get out of this kind of situation is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was to give you death. So that's what this particular verse is saying, ثُمَّ يُمِيتُكُمْ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then give you death, and that death is actually a blessing and a ni'mah for you. Now I'll just quickly, slightly just mention a particular masla here, a scholarly kind of debate, and that is that whether it is permissible for Muslims to long for death or to ask for death. Can they pray to Allah, "Oh Allah, give me death," and so on. Now when we look at the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find two types of hadiths. There's a hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said or has prohibited Muslims asking for death. That He has actually prohibited Muslims to pray to Allah and ask Allah for death. Whereas there is another hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has actually permitted people to ask for death. So because there is a contradiction between both the hadiths, so the scholars have reconciled between both the hadiths and have said that if a person is seeking death or asking for death due to worldly reasons, then that is something which will be impermissible and not allowed. So just say, for example, a person, he's ill and he's really, really ill and he's going to die soon, but then if he asks Allah, "Oh Allah, give me death quickly so I could, lighten my pain," and so on. So because that particular asking is for worldly purpose, for worldly and dunyawi reasons, so therefore that will be considered impermissible. Like sometimes people, they get depressed and so on. So again, to ask for like death in those situations will be impermissible. Then, however, if a person is asking for death for dini reasons, for religious reasons, like for example, he's living in such a community where there's so much fitna, so much mischief and so on, and there's a danger on his iman, and he thinks that if I was to live in this community or if I was to live in this particular society, then there's a big question mark over my iman. So in that situation, if he was to ask for death, then in that, and obviously he hopes that he'll die on iman, then in that situation it will be permissible. So just generally speaking, just to ask for death for dunyawi and worldly reasons, that would not be permissible. But anyway, just with regards to this particular verse, Allah has described death in the context of a blessing. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then goes on to say, ثُمَّ يُحْيِيكُمْ ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. That after He has given you death, He will then resurrect you again. He will then give you life again, ثُمَّ إِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ, and then to Him you will be returned. So obviously this is talking about Day of Judgment. Now on the Day of Judgment you will be given life, you will be resurrected, you will come out of your grave, and then you will stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will question you regarding certain things, will question you regarding how much knowledge you gained, how much wealth did you gain, what did you do with your time, what did you do with your youth, and so on, all these kind of questions. And obviously, if you were to be successful in answering these questions, then obviously the doors of Jannah and paradise will open up for you. However, if you can't successfully answer these questions, then obviously the doors of Jahannam will also open for you as well. Now the next verse, verse number 29, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again touches on the same theme, and that is regarding just reminding people of some blessings which He has showered on the humans and mankind. Verse number 29 begins with هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُم مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who created everything for you on this earth. Ma fil ard means wo jo zameen mein hai, i.e. everything which is on this earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for you. Now, this world or this dunya, this earth which we are living in, it has been created solely and exclusively for our pleasure and for our benefit. When we just look at everything of this earth, we use every single aspect and every single particle or substance of this world we are using. Just take example of the ground which we are walking on. So if there wasn't a ground, then how are we going to walk? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made the earth in such a way with the ground so that we can walk on it. And obviously, we're in situations where we cannot find water, then we can even use that ground and the dust and the mud from the ground to do tayammum on. Take an example of the clouds, that if there wasn't clouds and it was just all the time sun, then we will probably burn to death. But instead Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He created clouds so that He can give us shade, He can give us some kind of breathing space and some kind of like help from the hot scorching sun. You know, everything which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created in this earth is for our benefit. Even the animals as well, like the cows, the camels, the goats and so on, they are for our benefit. Then you may be thinking that, but like snakes and tigers, we don't eat them, so how are they for our benefit? But if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I touched on this topic, that snakes, tigers, even though you cannot eat them, but you know the skin of the snake, the skin of the tigers, in Islamic fiqh terminology is called dibagat. That what happens is that if you were to peel off or remove the skin from the snake, or if you were to remove the skin from the tiger, and then after that, if you were to put some chemicals inside so that the impurities of the skin is eradicated, or like they used to do in olden days, that they used to get the skins and they would leave it out in the hot baking sun so that the impurities can be extracted, then when that skin goes hard and rock hard, then you can actually use that skin for clothing purposes. You can make that skin into boots and wear boots. You can make that into like jackets and coats. You can even wear that, make into coats. You can use that as a rug, and you can even sleep on that. So even though these kind of animals like tigers, cheetahs, snakes and so on, even though we don't eat them, it's not for our, like, we don't use it for like food purposes, for sustenance purposes, but for clothing purposes, we're using those kind of animals. Then even you may be thinking about pigs and so on, but again, even pigs, like as I said not a few weeks ago, this is like many months ago, I mentioned regarding like gelatin extracts which are found in kind of tablets and capsules, whether you can use them. So as I mentioned, that you can use them as well. So every single animal, when you look at it, when you analyze it, even though you can't say, oh, I don't use a snake, but you are actually indirectly using it. Okay, you say I'm not using a kind of tiger and so on, so that is not a benefit for me, but you are. Even the trees, the trunks of the trees, you are using every single aspect of this world and dunya. But we kind of fail to acknowledge and realize that all this is a ni'mah and a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he goes on to say, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that everything which He has created in this world is for our benefit. ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى إِلَى السَّمَاءِ, and then after that He turned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned towards the heavens, towards the skies. فَسَوَّاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes the heavens into 7 skies. سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ, i.e. the skies or the asman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes it into a further 7 skies. Now the next point which we need to look at is what is meant by sab'a samawat. What is meant by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He made this, or He made the heavens or the skies into 7 further skies. Now, one particular commentary or one particular opinion is of Sab'a Samawat is that they are in fact 7 skies. Like we got a sky here, there on top of that there is another sky, and on top of that there is another sky all the way until the 7th heavens or the 7th sky, and then after that there will be the Arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is one opinion, and that is like the common tafsir or the common commentary which is used to describe Sab'a Samawat, that there are 7 heavens, there are 7 skies, the same way there are 7 earths. So similarly there are also 7 skies in the universe which we are living in. However, another opinion of the word Sab'a Samawat which some scholars have given is here Sab'a Samawat means 7 types or 7 levels of atmosphere. That there are 7 types of atmosphere. Now, if we take this particular opinion, then this will tell us, or this should tell all the Muslims and even non-Muslims of the words of the Holy Quran is in fact the true words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because 1400 years ago, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said Sab'a Samawat. But just recently, the scientists have kind of realized or kind of, just determined that the world which we are living in, it has 7 atmospheres. If you look in various kind of science books and so on, he actually names them, like there are 7 types of like atmosphere. Like the more higher you go, the more higher in altitude you go, there's like different types of atmosphere. There's different types of like air you're breathing and so on. So this is something which Allah told us 1400 years ago, but the scientists are just kind of like found out just now. So فَسَوْوَاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ. So the conclusion will be, one commentary will be Sab'a Samawat means 7 heavens, and the second commentary of that will be that there are 7 levels of atmosphere. وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows everything or has knowledge of every single thing. So again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finishing this particular verse by affirming one of his attributes, one of his sifat, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows everything, what is going on in this world, what is going on in people's hearts and minds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows every single thing. Now verse number 30, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Now verse number 30 is in fact the beginning of ruku number 4 of Surah Al-Baqarah. And those of you who probably studied the Quran will know or will realize that each ruku in the Holy Quran are linked in some way. Now in the previous couple of verses, we looked at some blessings which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has showered on mankind and on the human being. And the next few verses which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to mention, He's also going to touch on the same theme, and that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed some blessings and some ni'mah. But the difference between the verses which we are going to look at and the previous couple of verses is that the previous couple of verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala touched on blessings which are tangible, blessings which we can see. Like for example, the world, like the ground, the cows, the camels and so on. These things which are tangible, things which we can see. But in the coming verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again is going to touch on some blessings which He has showered on the human being, on mankind, but blessings which you can't see, blessings which you cannot feel, but you have those blessings. And what are those blessings? Number 1, knowledge. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unlike the angels and other people and other kind of creation who do whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders them to do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the gift of knowledge and apprehending and coming to conclusions using your brain and your intellect only to human beings. That a human being, for example, when he looks outside and he sees that the clouds are all black, he can easily derive through his knowledge and through his intellect that it's going to rain now. So this is something which only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to human beings. Dogs, cows, pigs and so on, they don't have those kind of knowledge. They cannot use their intellect, they cannot use their brain. Even the angels and so on, they don't have this kind of particular knowledge. Okay, because the angels, it's only that when Allah commands them to do something, that's when they do it. But they don't have a kind of like a brain or an intellect themselves where they can apprehend and come to conclusions and derive conclusions and kind of rulings and so on. They cannot do that. So that is one knowledge, that is one benefit and one blessing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed, is knowledge, and this is such a blessing which is intangible. And another blessing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to mankind, has given to all human beings, is honor and dignity. And that's why you know that when a person passes away, we don't like just chuck him into the fire and just tell him to burn, or we don't just leave his body to rot so that he just rot to whatever. But what we do is that we are ordered to give this person a ghusl and a bath. Then after that we are then ordered to shroud this person. Then after that we are then ordered to read janazah namaz for him. After that then we are ordered to bury that particular individual. The reason why is because of the honor and the dignity of a human being. And that's why, as we know, that you're not allowed to use human beings, like any kind of parts of a human being, like his skin. Unlike, animals such as snakes and tigers, I mentioned, you can tan their skin and you can use it for clothing purposes. But for human skins, you're not allowed to do that. When a human passes away, you can't peel his skin off and then use it for like boots and use it for coats and so on. Why? Because of the honor and the dignity of the human being. Okay, and this was an issue which we kind of looked at before when we were touched on the topic of organ transplant. So these are just a few ni'mah and a few blessings which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned, and that is knowledge and that is honor and dignity. And I'll just take this opportunity to also mention that knowledge, gaining knowledge, and in particular gaining sacred knowledge and ilm, then that is something which is very, very important for all Muslims. It comes in many hadiths. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that all the fish in the sea, they seek istighfar. They ask, istighfar, they pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the forgiveness of that individual or individuals who seek knowledge. In another hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has described an individual or a person who seeks knowledge as being in the path of Allah. فَهُوَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ حَتَّى يَرْجِعَ until he returns. Now, seeking knowledge is something which is very, very important for every single Muslim. Okay, many of us, we are kind of involved in other kind of activities, like secular activities, this kind of activity and so on, which is very, very good. Okay, you should like go to university, you should get a degree, you should go to college, get the good grades. But at the same time, you need to supplement that by learning and gaining Islamic knowledge. Okay, many of us, alhamdulillah, we come to the mosque and we read all our namaz and so on, we fast and so on. But then if we were to ask that particular brother, okay, like if we do this in namaz, we do namaz break and so on, few of us will know that particular masla or will know that particular rule. So it's very important that you try to gain knowledge. Okay, knowledge isn't just something specific with the ulamas and the scholars, that only the scholars are only designated to learn knowledge. Knowledge is something which every single Muslim has to learn. And that's why it's mentioned in the hadith, طَلَبُ الْإِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ, that to seek knowledge is a fariḍah, is first obligatory on every single Muslim. So we are young now, take this opportunity to learn knowledge, learn Muslim masail, learn laws and rulings. Okay, so this is very important. It's like the bread and butter of a Muslim. If you don't know how to read a namaz properly, and you're just reading your namaz, then obviously your namaz will be accepted. But just say, for example, like you were doing something which you didn't know that or you have to do, and you've been reading your namaz, then your namaz isn't accepted. There's many examples where a few days ago a brother asked me a question regarding, well, if I come late, if I'm masbook, if I come late, then how do I do qaza? How do I read my 2 rakat or 3 rakat? So I told him the ruling, and he was saying, oh, I've been doing the other way. So the sad scenario is that this person in namaz, the farziyat has been accepted, the obligation has been accepted, but whole his life he's been reading basic in namaz where he hasn't been getting the sawab. So it's very important that these kind of basic rulings, okay, we take the opportunity to learn. Okay, now alhamdulillah in England, in Birmingham, many places provide institutions. They have institutions where you can learn knowledge, seek ilm and so on. So alhamdulillah, take this opportunity and learn. So as I was saying, that this is one of the blessing and the ni'mah which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed on mankind, is knowledge and honor and dignity. Now if we have a look at verse number 13 in more detail, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. That when your Lord said to the angel, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, that I am going to make a deputy on earth. Khalifa means a deputy or a vice regent on earth. قالوا, the angels replied by saying, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءِ, that are you going to create those who will spread disorder? مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا, that are you going to create those kind of beings who are going to create disorder on earth, وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءِ, and will cause bloodshed. Now from this particular verse and approximately the next 10 verses or so, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to mention regarding the creation of Adam alayhi salam and the creation of human beings. And the first thing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions is that He says to the angels that I'm going to create a deputy and a vice regent. Upon which the angels replied by saying that, oh Allah, are you creating these kind of people, i.e. humans, who are going to cause mischief and fitna, as we can see, who are going to cause bloodshed, who will be killing each other? Are you going to create those kind of people who are going to do these kind of things and then at the same time be your Khalifa, be your deputy, and be your vice regent? Now before we delve into this kind of issue in more detail, there's a couple of things here. When you analyze this particular verse, it seems as though that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking for guidance or something which is known as mashwara from the angels. It's like the way Allah has put it is that, oh angels, I'm thinking, or I want to make a vice regent or a deputy on earth. And as you know that, obviously when you ask mashwara or when you ask guidance or counsel from anyone, let's say for example you intend to get married, then you'll go to someone who's wise, you'll go to someone who's knowledgeable, and then you'll ask that particular individual that, oh sheikh, or this, like I want to get married or I want to start a business and so on, then what is your advice and so on. However, as all of you know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the most wise, He's the most knowledgeable, then it doesn't really make sense in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking the angels, like I am intending to make a deputy and a vice regent, what do you think? Now the answer to that particular issue will be, or that particular objection will be, is that here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't asking for mashwara, isn't asking for counsel, but He's put it or He phrased it in a mashwara kind of statement to show the significance of asking for mashwara and counsel. That even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He could do whatever He wants. So but He put it in a phrase to the angels that, oh angels, what do you think? I am intending to make a deputy and a vice regent. So even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to create human beings, but He put it or He phrased it in a statement like of a mashwara, like of a advice, to show the importance of mashwara and advice and counseling. And this is also very important as well. Another important kind of point which we can deduce from here is the importance of mashwara. That whenever you do something, whether you intend to get married, whether you want to open a business, whether you want to do a particular degree, always ask for mashwara. There's always barakah and there's always blessings in there. When you look at the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was infallible, meaning that he couldn't commit mistakes. It's impossible for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to make mistakes, to do sins and so on. But even then, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would seek mashwara and blessings and advice from his sahabas, from his companions, in particular where there were battles and wars and so on. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would always take mashwara from his companions and from his sahabas. Why? To show the importance of mashwara. And that's why it's mentioned in a hadith of Sunan al-Bayhaqi that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had said that whenever you do mashwara and the decision which you come to and everybody agrees on that, then this decision which you have come to, or the judgment which you have come to, it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that the individual who gave that mashwara, that I think we should do this today, and everybody agrees, then that mashwara which that individual got is like a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's like the importance of like doing mashwara and so on. But anyway, even though, as I said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't going to actually do, He wasn't actually doing mashwara with the angels, because obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He could do whatever He wants, but He phrased it in that way to show the significance of that particular sunnah. Then he goes on to say, قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيُسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ. Now just another couple of points here is regarding this word Khalifa. Now what is meant by Khalifa and what is meant by deputy and so on. Now the belief, or our belief, the belief of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that sovereignty, or like sovereignty belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's many places in the Holy Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in hukmu illa lillah, that all judgment and all sovereignty belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That basically everything, this world, everything is under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's control and power. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to implement his laws and his rules and his legislation in this world, he chose a deputy. He chose someone who will implement these laws, who will implement these legislations, who will implement these rules. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he chose people who have impeccable characteristics such as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he chose them to be his prophet, his messenger, his khalifa, his deputy on earth. So the very first khalifa, i.e. Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, all the way until Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not only were they messengers in terms of like they were conveying the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they were also khalifas, they were also deputies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world, on earth, to implement the laws and the rules and the legislations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this concept of khilafah and this concept of establishing like the khilafah and so on is the sunnah, not of just Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it's a sunnah which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began before the beginning of creation, and he started with Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam all the way until Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now what used to happen before with the Jews is that whenever in the Banu Israel, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a prophet and a prophet passed away, straight away Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made another person a prophet. When that prophet passed away, straight away another person was made a prophet. And this is actually established in a hadith of Sahih al-Bukhari narrated by Sayyidina Ibn Abbas radhiyallahu anhu, that this prophet passed away, another prophet, and so on and so forth. So in the previous nation, there wasn't this kind of system of a khilafah, because obviously the prophet, at the same time he was a messenger, he was also a khalifa as well. But in our ummah, because after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam there is going to be no more prophet, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through his infinite wisdom, obviously Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well, decided that we will then choose people who are not prophets, who haven't been chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that we will then have what he calls successors, and we will then choose people who will carry out this sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and this way and practice of all the prophets before. So that's why when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, you had Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu as the first Khalifa. You had Hazrat Umar radhiyallahu anhu as the second Khalifa, Hazrat Uthman as the third, and Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhuma as the fourth Khalifa. So this Khilafat system is something which is a way and is a method of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because obviously after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, there's not going to be no prophets to implement the laws and the rules and the legislation. So therefore Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam decided that what will happen is that we will choose people who again, like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who had impeccable characteristics, who were very, very good. They will then lead the Muslim ummah for the next few years, on the next decades and generations. Now, one point with regard to this particular issue before we finish is that it comes in a hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abu Dawood, and Musnad Ahmad, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that the Khilafah will only last for 30 years. And then after that, there'll only be kings and muluk and ubud and so on. There'll only be kings and so on. So what is the meaning of this particular hadith? Now the meaning of this particular hadith is that the Khulafai Rashidin, because if we were to count how long they were in charge of, how long they were like the Amir of, it equals to around 27, 28 years. So the Khulafai Rashidin, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying that they will only be Khilafat for 30 years, meaning that the Khulafai Rashidin will be such who will implement the laws and the rules and the legislation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on ala minhajin nubuwa, on the correct way, 100% on the correct way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then after the death of Sayyidina Ali radhiyallahu anhu, whoever comes into power, like Hazrat Muawiyah radhiyallahu anhu and so on and so forth, they will also, you can call them Khalifa, because they are also implementing the laws and the legislations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it's not going to be 100% on the ways as Sayyiduna Abu Bakr anhu did, as Hazrat Umar anhu did, as Hazrat Uthman anhu did, and Hazrat Ali anhu did. And that's why it's mentioned in the hadith that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam described before he passed away, he said that along with following my sunnah, alaykum bi sunnati, also follow the sunnah and the ways of the Khulafai Rashideen, also the ways of Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu, Sayyidina Umar, Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali. Why? Because their implementation of the Sharia and the laws and the verses of the Holy Quran and the Hadith is going to be on the correct way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is like the meaning of this particular hadith. Obviously, this is like a kind of common question that, what is this khilafah? Should we establish a khilafah and so on? So obviously, the belief of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that it is obligatory, it is like an obligation to establish a khilafah, to establish an Islamic state. But what we say is that establishing a khilafah is also an obligatory duty. Similarly, reading namaz is also obligatory duty. Giving zakat is also obligatory duty. Fasting, that is also obligatory duty as well. The problem with some people is that their whole life is just spent on khilafah, and you don't see them ever coming to the masjid and reading namaz. You don't see them ever they're probably possible, Allah Alam, but you don't even see them like practicing and so on, but they all talk about khilafah. We also say, yes, there should be a khilafah, but at the same time we also say that reading namaz is also important. We also read namaz. You need to seek knowledge, seek ilm and so on. That is also important as well. Okay, so these groups who say that khilafah, there should always be a khilafah. Okay, we say that yes, it is necessary to have a khilafah. It's an obligation. However, reading namaz is also obligation. Doing the other acts of Islam, that is also obligation as well. Not just khilafah is an obligation. Everything, as I mentioned before, that the term ibadat doesn't just mean that just read namaz and that's it, and you just go home and just forget about everything else. But ibadat means namaz and doing everything. Okay, like giving zakat, being kind to your parents, being kind to the poor, being kind to the neighbors, being kind to the orphans, everything, not deceiving a Muslim brother, all that comes under the concept of ibadah. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala see tawfiq to act on what we said, wa akhiru da'wa alhamdulillah. Do you have any questions?
The capsule which we use is it allowed?
It is, Mufti Muhammad Shafi Rahmatullah and Mufti Taqi Usman, they've given the fatwa that it's permissible as long as another effective or readily halal medicines are available.